So hello from Cologne, Germany. My name is Tim Lücke. Together with Sonja Niemeyer, who is also here in the call. I'm the co-founder of Transatlantika. We are a social benefit company trying to promote transatlantic cooperation, exchange, discussion, all that fun stuff. Today's format, I'm gonna start with the format. We have three excellent panelists for our discussion today, and the format is gonna be that we're gonna start the discussion off by giving them a bunch of questions that we're gonna discuss, and then we're going to open it up after 40 minutes or so to a more general Q&A discussion from the audience. So there he is, Thomas Kleine-Brockhoff. Very good to see you. Thank you for joining us. Then I'll get started. So as you all know, the topic of today is the announcement by the German Bundeskanzler, Chancellor Olaf Scholz, about some rather radical changes in German foreign policy. We think that deserves a more serious discussion than we have seen so far. We have assembled sort of a dream team panel for this evening, I would like to say. So let me briefly introduce them. We have Thomas Kleine-Brockhoff here. He is the Vice President and Executive Director of the Berlin office at the German Marshall Fund. Prior to his work at the GMF, he was advisor to Germany's President Joachim Gauck and the Washington bureau chief of Die Zeit, Germany's sort of intellectual weekly newspaper. And Thomas is one of the key intellectual figures in Germany, especially when it comes to matters of transatlantic relations. So thank you very much for joining us. Also, in this context, want to recommend his book, The World Needs the West, A Fresh Start for a Liberal Order. Also on the panel tonight is Rick Herman, a social behavioral sciences distinguished professor emeritus at the Ohio State University. Rick's work spans a wide range of topics in security affairs, international relations, and foreign policy. He has published more than 30 book chapters or articles and authored or edited 3 books. And aside from his work in academia, Rick has also worked for the US State Department in the H.W. Bush administration and organized conflict resolution workshops with the US Information Agency. He was also a member of my dissertation committee. And finally, we have Colonel Peter Mansour, who's that's a long title, the General Raymond E. Mason Jr. Chair of Military History at the Ohio State University. When I prepared for today, I went through his CV and I could have spent all day on it. It's wow, it's just wow. Pete has been a member of the US Army for 26 years. He retired at the rank of colonel and was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal. He served 2 combat tours in Iraq and received 2 Bronze Stars, 1 for valor. Pete was also the founding director of the US Army Marine Corps Counterinsurgency Center and a member of the Joint Chief of Staff Strategy Group to reassess the strategy in Iraq. From 2007 until 2008, he was the executive officer to the commanding general in Iraq, David Petraeus, and he played a key role in operationalizing the so-called surge. Pete has also published a book on his experience in this time, Surge, which I can highly recommend, but he also authored a whole range of other books on the history of warfare, military strategy, or counterinsurgency. He's a lifelong member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and as I just alluded to earlier, he has given one of the most memorable presentations I've ever witnessed about how they implemented the surge in Iraq, in particular in Baghdad. And I think I will never forget those maps with the red blots of violence that slowly shrinked over time. And I actually still talk about this presentation today, just 2 weeks ago. So we have a dream team of panelists in the sense that they both bring theoretical expertise and combined with practical experience. I think this is very important nowadays, especially for the topic today. But we also have a dream team sort of institutions that came together here, namely the German Marshall Fund, the premier think tank in Germany, I would say, and the Mershon Center, which is one of the premier academic institutions in the United States. And one of the goals of Transatlantika is to bring think tanks and academia together, because they both do great work, but they also have blind spots. And I think if they work together, they can just bring the best of two worlds together. So in general, Transatlantika lives by the principle that we are stronger together. That applies to transatlantic relations, but it also applies to how we like to work. So it's a great pleasure to organize this event with the Mershon Center. And I want to thank in particular Chris Gelpy, the current director, Kyle McCrae, and especially Kelly Whitaker, the communication specialist at the Mershon, for their excellent work in putting this together. But I also don't want to forget Bonja Ganster at the German Marshall Fund, who has been very helpful in putting this together. Okay, so we don't just want to promote the exchange between think tanks and academic institutions, we also want to promote the exchange between experts and the general public. So I'm very glad to see so many of you that have been able to take the time to attend this discussion, very important discussion, I think, tonight. Before we dive in, let me talk about some logistics. If you can, we want to have this as a sort of an open discussion in the second half, but for now, we would ask the audience to mute their microphones. We also disabled chat because we think it can be quite distracting. And we would ask you to hold all your questions for part 2 of today's event. So if you have a question and you are scared to forget it, then just write it down. We are very virtual today, but pen and paper are still very helpful. Okay, I think we're going to get started. So obviously, we all been taken by surprise by the Russian intervention in Ukraine. Not quite by surprise, maybe, but I for my part, didn't expect it. And soon thereafter, on February 27th, Chancellor Olaf Scholz held a speech at the Bundestag in Germany, where he announced a set of wide-ranging changes to German foreign policy. I talked to an American friend about a week later and told him, isn't this crazy? And he said, well, what happened? So a lot of Americans didn't even seem to notice that there was something going on. A couple of days later, I talked to a German friend, and that person was like, wait, what happened? 1 billion euros for the Bundeswehr? So even in Germany, a lot of people didn't really catch the news amongst all the flurry of news about Russia. So I would like you, Thomas, to maybe get us started by telling us what exactly was announced on February 27th, what exactly happened, and why is this such a remarkable change, potentially, in German foreign policy?
Thank you, Tim. Couple of points. It would be giving it short thrift if one interpreted what has happened as the decision to increase a defense budget. It is much more than that. And let me start by saying German strategy used to be a three-legged stool. Security in cooperation with the United States, energy in cooperation with Russia, and a market from China. That's in the shortest of brevity what this was about. All three legs of the stool have been cut off. In this now famous Sunday speech, a drastic course correction has been announced, correcting two of those three. That is the energy piece and the defense piece. The defense piece is the easiest to be addressing because it's been discussed in this country for a decade, but never sufficiently acted on, only gradually being acted on. Now it's drastically being acted on. A different energy policy is also underway. And the question now is whether it's going to happen overnight. Yesterday, a pre-alarm state was announced in terms of gas supplies, anticipating a decision that actually didn't happen today, which is that Mr. Putin would cut off gas supplies as of today. And the third one refers to the China question. Are we going to do the same thing with China that we're going to do? Are we going to run into the same problem with China that we have been running into with Russia? And how to deal with that? That's the open question. And the bigger question behind it is, what type of globalization model do we have in future as a consequence of this invasion? That is the question unanswered by this. Now, there's going to be consequences. This is a domestic policy change that is going to have, which is my second point, international consequences. The first one is this move was so drastic that it was noticed. That it's in itself has a consequence, because there's going to be, and we already see this, a domino effect. French have announced increases in their major increases in their defense budget, and they're looking at Russia differently. Other European countries with these two leading will be following, which leads me to the second point, which points to the United States. One of the consequences of this new threat assessment about Russia within Europe is, of course, that the argument that was made by some in the United States that an alliance is a net minus to the United States is going to be increasingly hard to be made, given that Europe under French and German leadership is going to change course here, given that
Hey, Susan, how's it going?
invasion.
Good. How are you?
Good. I'm sorry, I was on a webinar. Let me mute this guy.
No.
Hello, sorry, could somebody mute that person? I think, thank you. Go ahead.
So we're going to have a set of international repercussions of that. So one of the critiques that people like myself have been making of this German government and the previous German government is that they haven't been, since Joe Biden took office, that they haven't been investing into the US relationship. in a sufficient way. They've been welcoming the change towards the transatlantic relationship that has been introduced by Joe Biden first day in office and ever since. But they have been welcoming that. They have seen that as a normalization. But have they been investing in it? I would say not so. Now, this is a major investment when you think of dropping Nord Stream 2 as a project and reinvesting in defense in ways that the US had been calling for years, and given a different threat assessment here, had not been acted on, at least not in such a drastic form before. So those would be, I would stop right here as an opening remark, a strategic reassessment with international ripple effects.
Well, thank you very much. I very much, we already had this discussion, like the three-legged stool analogy. And clearly also in the announcement for the event, we focused on the defense aspect of the changes that were announced. Still, those were also quite significant, right? The announcement was sort of that Germany is going to pay their 2% and more fees to NATO. So that's an increase in defense spending. And there will be a 100 billion euro one-time investment in the infrastructure or in the Bundeswehr. I want to ask you, maybe starting with Rick, how have you perceived and understood the recent announcements by the Chancellor? Thank you.
Well, I'm far away, so let me start with suggesting two things. One, I think it's been the position of the German government for a long time that multilateralism in a European context is absolutely central to German foreign policy, and that it has to be part of a European community in order to exercise its power in the best possible ways. And in the past, that meant focusing more on economic power and other kinds of diplomatic and social power, and not playing up so much the military side of this. But the commitment to well, I'll call it post-World War II, and then certainly a post-Cold War notion of a liberal world order where rules and negotiation would replace what I grew up with in the Cold War, which was a very hardened military confrontation between the East and West, would rule. And when there have been violations to that, even outside the theater or outside Europe, for example, when Saddam Hussein went into Kuwait, or more harsh or hard for the Germans, a bigger choice was when the United States invaded Iraq. The German reaction was very sharp and very clear that these were clean violations of what it assumed were the multinational rules of the road. Probably the clearest violation now we've seen in the post-Cold War world is Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So on the first point I want to make, I see a lot of continuity, actually, in the German reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, very much similar to the way the French and the Germans reacted to the American invasion of Iraq, which of course was much further away and not a direct threat to them. But in terms of an outraged reaction to the violation of norms and principles, I see this as very central to Germany. It will move a lot of German public opinion, I think, and I believe it has. Now, it also, of course, has affected people's view of Russia and its leader, Vladimir Putin, which I think was the subject of a big debate in Europe over the last 20 years, with many people in Europe, particularly in Germany and in France, committed to what I guess, by lack of a better term, I call it sort of a continuation of Ostpolitik, a notion that through engagement, you both buy leverage with Russia, but you also diffuse some of Russia's angst about the West. And you hope over time that you can have some kind of common community with Russia by not provoking it or threatening it, but by trying to involve it. And that's become very hard in the last 20 years. particularly the last 15 or so, since 2007, it became quite clear that President Putin was increasingly taking a hostile view of the United States especially, but the Western world more generally. As an ally of the United States, his criticisms became sharper and sharper. His sense of alienation became sharper and sharper. I remember not too long ago, Chancellor Merkel suggesting that she'd seen large changes in Putin and that he was now engaged in kind of a different reality. I don't know, maybe that was 3 or 4 years ago. And I think I heard Chancellor Scholz say that anyone who'd been talking with Putin recently, as much as he had been in these negotiations prior to the invasion of Ukraine, would have to now conclude he was bent on empire. And that whatever you thought about Putin over the last 15 years, wherever you thought Russia was, however we got here, whose fault it was that he feels this way or that, is kind of now water under the bridge. We are where we are. And he thinks these ways, and he's bent on a particular approach to the West, picked up the gauntlet here and has decided to challenge not just Ukraine, but he made it very clear in February 22nd speech and the 24th speech and the 26th speech, that this was a war against the United States and the Western-led order. Ukraine was the battlefield, but the adversaries were the US. That's, of course, a very popular line in Russia. So I'm sure that's why he frames it that way, where the attack on Ukraine is not so popular. But then, you know, the German reaction to that, I think, I won't say it's overdetermined by external events, but it would be hard not to react in this way to a military invasion not very far away by a leader who you've watched over the last 15 years evolve in a very hostile direction, and now has decided, it seems, to make this the point of challenge. So yes, I see it as a big change. I'll make one third point and then pass. There's a big distance to go between pronouncement and implementation. Julia Freelander, I've been watching on the Atlantic Council, which I've been a member of for a long time, suggesting that in the United States, we have a long history with sanctions and sanction implementation, and we've developed fairly muscular bureaucracies to implement sanctions because it's become probably the go-to tool of American foreign policy on the coercive side. And it's complicated and it's difficult, as you can see at the tip of the iceberg, and just rooting out where Russian oligarch money is hidden. But of course, to implement all of the sanctions that the Treasury Department and others have now been tasked to do in the United States is difficult. I'm not convinced Germany and France and others have that same kind of muscular bureaucratic capacity developed yet. They will need to. We'll have to see how that goes. It'll take time to develop those kind of tools. And even more so on the military front. I agree very much with Thomas that this is a signal and a declaration of change in strategy that's just impossible to ignore. At the same time, it's going to take a good bit of time in order to see the fruit of that investment come out in military capacity. And it's just, there's a long lead time on the development of weapon systems and on the development of military power. And across that lead time, and this again, we'll just have to wait and see, we're in the very midst of what I would call rally around the flag shock at this invasion. I worry, and I suspect this is going to be a long slog in Ukraine. This could be Russia taking eastern districts for a decade or more. And we come to some kind of stalemated outcome for a while, much like we saw in the Cold War. And then how long will the unity of the West last? Those are questions for us further down the road. But as I say, there's a distance to go here between pronouncement, which I agree is a dramatic change, and implementation, which will take a lot longer. I'll stop there.
Wow, thank you. I have 20 more questions right here, but I'm going to start with Pete now. And I do want to hark back on the military aspects here, because you know, I actually have a photograph hanging here on the wall of a burning city in France. It was taken during World War II, and it always serves as a reminder why I'm doing what I'm doing. So for the American part of the members of the audience also, I mean, this sort of, when you hear the chancellor say 100 billion euros for the German Bundeswehr, that has a very different effect in Germany than it has in the United States, I think, So I do agree also with what Thomas was saying, that the Bundeswehr has been in rather a desolate state. I mean, we sort of crack jokes about it here. So this change was coming either way. I just not so sure that was the right moment and the right way to do it, but we can talk about that later. I want to ask you, Pete, what's your impression? Is the Bundeswehr actually in such bad shape, and what will those changes actually do to improve its operational capacity?
I think what's happened recently is reality has smacked the German government over the forehead. Throughout the Cold War, at least since rearmament in the 1950s, the Bundeswehr became a pretty capable instrument of defense. It reached a strength of almost 500,000 in the height of the Cold War. But since the reunification of Germany, I think the German government has been relying on NATO writ large to underwrite its security. Today, the problem with the Bundeswehr, it's not its quality. It's got some really good equipment, good soldiers. The Leopard 2 A7 is a great tank. Got pretty good armored personnel carriers, decent anti-tank weapons, artillery. But let's take a look at the numbers. Right now, the German army has about 62,000 soldiers. It has not even built up to the Treaty of Versailles limits that were imposed by the Allies after World War I to neuter Germany. The bottom line is the German army could not defend Germany today if it were invaded. And overall, the Bundeswehr, with the Navy and the Air Force included, has about 183,000 personnel. It makes it about the size of the United States Marine Corps. So Germany has a long way to go to develop viable military forces that could actually defend Germany, much less move east and defend the eastern part of NATO in conjunction with its allies. 100 billion euros is a good start. It's a small down payment, but what we need to see from Germany is a sustained increase in its defense budget over a number of years, as Rick suggested, to build up the troop strength to numbers where the German army is an actual contributor to security in Europe, and not one that just relies on NATO writ large to underwrite its security.
Thank you. Let me get back to Berlin real quick. Thomas, the German Marshall Fund had a virtual event the day after the announcement by the chancellor, which was terrific. I attended. And you asked a question that I'm going to ask you now. How did this change come about? Right? We know also that there were certain changes or necessary changes that weren't really implemented by the German government, because probably out of fear of domestic opposition, and changes or increase to the military budget were certainly one of those. And then all of a sudden it went very, very quickly. And I don't want to give anything away, but can you walk us through how this decision came about?
One answer in context and one in detail. This country in its constitution, as West Germany, had a foreign policy goal, which is reunification peace. Post 1990, it became a status quo power. This was the environment surrounded by friends, and actually we used to say encircled by friends, that was most beneficial to solve what was framed as the German question of a country since industrialization that is too big to be one of many in Europe and too small to run Europe. some ways to do that have been tried and tested and failed in pretty brutal ways. In these last 30 years, this love affair with the status quo that has solved this question in peace and in a peaceful relationship with neighbors has resulted in complacency. Status quo and complacency are twins in some ways. And as I think Peter was saying, reality has hit them on the head. The foreign policy community has been pushing for a change for many years. I've been part of that argument for much more than a decade. Never succeeded. Reality has hit them on the head, and the Ukraine crisis brought it to the fore. If to a fresh government, new in office, unburdened by the history of and the decisions of the previous government, at least of the previous chancellor, and under heavy critique by all of its allies. I think for external pressure played a big role here. Mr. Scholz couldn't go to Washington, which he did, while being Lord Voldemort of European politics. The name thou shalt not speak, Nord Stream 2. He didn't even mention the name. So it became an impossible position to hold vis-a-vis France, vis-a-vis Poland, vis-a-vis Great Britain, most importantly, vis-a-vis the United States. There was a domestic pressure. There was the pressure of reality against long-held belief systems that were most importantly held within his own party, his own group. This was as much a sort of inner party combat, so to say, as it was one on the international stage. This became unbearable. They understood that they can't make small changes, but they need to make big changes. And if they make big changes, they can't go through a whole process because of the external environment. But also, had he gone through an internal process, he probably would have failed. And he would have failed within his own party. That's why he decided to exert leadership, to spend political capital that he had just acquired in winning an election, in going out on a Sunday morning into the German Bundestag, having consulted, as we think we know by now, maybe with a half a dozen people, maybe a little more, within the period of 3 or 4 days, and having announced this decision and having drawn conclusions from that only afterwards. It is remarkable, I think, that we've seen this. This is not more than a speech, and I agree. There is a long way between announcement and implementation. But what we've seen since is two pretty remarkable things that are happening. One is it took exactly 10 days to make a decision, not 10 weeks, not 10 months. And you could have thought about 10 years, given the inner party debate in social democracy, on acquiring F-35 for the nuclear deterrence capacity to replace the current system, heavily disputed in his own group. Took 10 days. That itself is a nuclear signal to Putin that this was done within 10 days. And another 10 days later, the debate started. Here's not yet the decision, but we haven't had this before of an Iron Dome type defense system, missile defense system that we hadn't talked about before in this country. Those are two things that happened in two 10-day segments. So I think that tells you that not only was this sort of an assault on his own party, but since then, that debate hasn't slowed, but decisions have been made and movement including on the budgetary implementation, has been put forward. So I'm actually less concerned with the implementation as of now. Let's see in 2 years, but for now, things are happening. I'm more concerned with the other parts of that announcement, with the strategic parts, but I think we can get to that later.
All right. Rick, you mentioned that multilateralism has been sort of a key component of policy also for Germany. I was still struck, though, that the German government or Chancellor Scholz never actually mentioned a European defense force, right? That would have been sort of the alternative for sort of sending it, or an alternative way to send a signal to Putin. Mr. President Macron has been floating that idea for a long time, but now instead of saying, okay, we build a strong European defense, the German government says we're going to increase our military budget, and then the French increase their military budget. So that would be one question. How really is this multilateralism?
I actually think it's pretty real. First, in August, the Council of the European Union published this strategic compass that got a lot of attention, and I read pretty carefully, and I think it obviously is a compromise document, as anything coming out of the Council would need to be. But it talks about, shared leadership and streamlining decision-making away, or ways even with the unanimity decision-making rule to find ways to get decisions done more quickly. And on the military front, talks about a rapid deployment force of 5,000 troops. And it talks about, a more muscular approach to combating disinformation. And it makes very clear that all of this package is part and parcel of 5 points, but one of those 5 points is continued strong relationship with NATO and the United States. It's not an either or, it's in addition to. And I just point to the force that they could use for deployment to crises or emergencies. They're hoping in the next few years to be able to mount 5,000 troop force that would have some kind of lift capacity to deploy to places. Well, Putin had close to 200,000 troops. Russia had close to 200,000 troops invading Ukraine. There is only NATO that could answer that if you were going to have to answer it militarily. We're very far away. I mean, not we as Americans, but I think the Europeans in a common security and defense policy are still a long ways away from being able to have a military force that would actually be able to work together outside NATO to meet the reality that Thomas and Pete mentioned is now facing them from the East. And so I don't really see this as a deviation from multilateralism, cooperation with France. I can't tell how much President Macron and Chancellor Scholz were coordinating what they were doing prior to the war in their consultations with President Putin. I don't know how much they're coordinating now, but it looks to me they're pretty close. There seem to be, if not daily, then multi times a week, conversations between chancellors and presidents within the leading group. Just yesterday, I believe, they were on a phone with Biden and with each other and with several others. And so I guess I at least for now, for some time in the future, I don't see this as a Europe separating from the United States in confronting Russia, or for that matter, taking on China, which is a much more, well, not much more, it's a complicated problem also. I see rather both the United States and to a large degree Germany still looking at ways to have independent capacity, but very strong allied capacity. When Jake Sullivan first became announced as a national security advisor, there was a meeting that I heard him part of, and said that his main strategic goal, drawing on Dean Acheson, was to build centers of strength. And NATO, of course, was the #1 in his mind that would make American policy have the capacity to deal with global challenges worldwide. And I can see, or I can imagine a German, French, European, more broadly, consensus that they need to have more capacity at home to deal with this and some kind of common European defense policy and capability, but at the same time allied to NATO. So I guess I've said that several times. I don't see it as competitive just yet with NATO, or because the numbers here are just not big enough. One last point. You know, it was in the old days when I first started into this 40 years ago, and people asked about the purpose of NATO, you know, both to contain the Soviet Union and to contain people's fears of Germany, was a constant kind of saw I heard often back in the 60s and 70s and the like. I think now there has been many years of highly transparent decision-making because German and French and other leaders across Europe, especially on the 12 original members of NATO, sit in each other's war councils, so to speak. Doesn't mean they always agree, as say the Iraq War, but it would be very difficult for any of the large militarily capable states, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, United Kingdom, to plan some kind of threat to each other, given the highly integrated nature of the military command structures. That doesn't mean they're going to coordinate unnecessarily defense spending, right? That has domestic budgetary things. People like to buy their own equipment because it's the same reason Americans like to spend on defense spending. So interoperability is going to continue to be a challenge politically. But I don't see it as a likelihood that it's going to create threats within the core allies.
Okay, thanks. Pete, let me ask you, for me as a sort of, I have no idea how this works. You take 100 billion euros and invest it in the military. What does this actually look like? I wrote, as I wrote in that question, you don't just go to Walmart and say, I want 1,000 tanks and a couple of F-35s. So how will that actually be translated into military capability? And then the second question I would have is, there seems to be an agreement here on the panel that Russia clearly has aggressive intentions. And so this increase in military spending is a signal towards Russia. Does it help the Ukrainians in any way at this point?
So you're right. To build up the German armed forces, you need sustained spending over time, because it takes time to recruit and train new soldiers, new airmen, new sailors. It takes time to buy new equipment, and a one-time infusion can't do that. You got to commit to paying those personnel over the course of their careers. And this is why you need a sustained increase in the defense budget. What a one-time infusion could do up front is start to purchase the infrastructure required to expand the force. So you can buy base infrastructure, for instance, or renovate bases that have been mothballed. You can improve transportation and lines of communication that would enable German forces to move east, should that become necessary. So I would say infrastructure spending is probably the most important here. You can buy some equipment with that money as well, if you have the personnel to operate it, or if it's a one-for-one replacement. For instance, the German military is in the process of switching out the Marder armored personnel vehicle with the Puma. And so you could accelerate that transition if you want to do that. You can buy more F-35s, provided the United States can produce them quickly enough. So you can do that. In terms of what it will do for Ukraine, directly not much. It is a signal to NATO that Germany is committed to its own defense and to the defense of NATO. And as far as multilateralism is concerned, you know, a European defense force, or a NATO force for that matter, is merely national forces that have been amalgamated together. And so Germany increasing its defense spending is going to buy capabilities that can be provided to a European defense force or to NATO if that's the decision of the government. So I don't see that as working at cross purposes with alliance politics at all. What will help Ukraine is an infusion of weapons. Germany has already authorized, I think for the first time since 1945, the provision of lethal weapons, Panzerfaust 3s to Ukraine. Ukraine needs air defense systems, they need anti-tank systems, and increasingly they're asking for systems that would allow them to go on the offense and recover lost territory. That would be tanks and armored personnel carriers and aircraft. NATO hasn't gone there yet. But if Rick's right, and this is a long war, we may get to that point where we make the political decision to allow the Ukrainians to go on the offensive and recover lost territory.
All right, thanks. I think I have one more question for Thomas, and then I want to open it up to the audience. I'll have another couple of questions, but I'll leave those for potentially later. We asked Heinrich August Winkler, who you know well, a German historian, for those of you who don't know, about the current situation in Ukraine and Russia. He just wrote a one-page article in Die Zeit about Russia. And I asked him whether this was sort of Rick's question, like, is this just a temporary thing? Is this just a rally around the flag effect, right? So for those of you in the audience who don't know, rally around the flag effect usually means all of a sudden we have war and everything your president does is golden, right? To simplify the matter. And then later on, those changes are not followed through. But from everything we heard here today, and from everything you told us about the infighting, even within the SPD, these announcements are not just empty words, right? Heinrich August Winkler actually wrote me, he said that if they are not following through on those words, that the coalition might not survive the first year in office, right? So for me, then the question arises, and that's a question I wanted to ask up front. This is a huge investment. And on top of that, you have the changes in energy policy, which are also very costly, right? And I asked this rather provocatively, but we now had COVID for 2 years, and the German government promised 1 billion euros for the cultural sector, which was never really spent. And now we have an announcement of 100 billion euro spending plus 2% NATO plus commitment to nuclear sharing plus a new energy policy. How is the German government going to pay for it, especially given that it looks very difficult for them to back out of this?
Yeah, they are going to pay for it because the German government has deep pockets. The Germany had post 2008 financial crisis, which was responded to with a Keynesian spending attempt, in which the debt to GDP ratio went up by 20 points, has managed to reduce the debt to GDP ratio back to 60%, which is the limit that economists see as sustainable. COVID has brought it back up to 70%. All that spending on COVID, and there was a lot of spending during COVID, only brought it back up to 70%, much lower than the debt GDP ratio of the United States, for example. Therefore, there's room to invest, and there's room to go into debt. The question is rather whether it is politically viable to do so, given that the mainstay of German austerity politics is part of the government in the economically conservative party within that government. So far, so good. They have accepted the fact that these are extraordinary times, that they have that principle will only guide them, will take them so far. They've been willing to accept increased debt-financed defense spending. And just one word about the 100 billion. The more important announcement was not the 100 billion. That's as Peter rightly says, it's a one-time thing. The more important thing is that from this year onward, the 2% goal will be exceeded. That means that you're going to have a sustained budget, a sustained 2% defense budget. The 100 billion are just helping to get you there immediately so that you can make immediate investment decisions that have long-term consequences. Otherwise, you would have to ramp up the defense budget in multiple steps and you would lose time. So that's the rationale behind this. But the more important thing is the long-term, the announcement of a long-term commitment. Let's be careful about that. People are elected in democracies for 4 years. Let's see what the next government has to say about that. But the commitment is there. The finances are doable.
All right, thank you very much. So again, now we want to open it up to the audience for general questions. As we might have said, we at Transatlantika, we don't want to just bring think tanks and experts from academic institutions together. We also want to bring experts and the general public together because we think this is a crucial part of what makes a vibrant democracy. So we have still disabled. Let me see if I see all of you. You should be able now to raise your hands. Kelly, if you could, we could go back to the all tile look. Kelly.
1 second.
And then I will do my best to take your questions in order. Oh, it's just Pete there.
Okay, do you see it in gallery mode now?
We see your name now. 2 people have raised their hands. All right, while we're waiting for the gallery mode.
If you go to your upper right, go to gallery mode, you can see everyone.
There we go. All right, I'm not sure who raised their hand first, so I'm gonna start with Miriam Browning and then Alice Lucas. Miriam.
Question on American forces in Germany. And perhaps, Peter, you're a good one to answer, and especially since I was there during the Cold War in Berlin. How do you see the future? More or less American forces? And for the German gentleman on the panel, what is the German view of American forces in Europe these days? So it's an interesting question.
Yeah, so at the height of the Cold War, there were, 250 to 300,000 American troops in Germany. It was a significant number. That's down to less than 60,000 now. And it doesn't represent a lot of ground combat capability. There's a Stryker brigade, there's an airborne brigade in Italy, quite a bit of air power, but there is room for growth should the US government decide that more permanent stationing of US troops in Europe is necessary, and if NATO also thinks it's necessary. I think an interesting question is there going to be a permanent American presence in Poland? There is already a rotational brigade there. There's other rotational units that go through the Baltic states. And I think there will be and should be some serious consideration put into a permanent stationing of an American ground force in Poland, closer to where the front line would be. But Germany certainly is close enough if we want to reinforce immediately. The base structure is there, and it would be a more immediate infusion of troops. But I really think the next step would be a brigade to Poland, maybe even a division.
All right. Alice Lücke.
Yeah, hi. Actually, I only wanted to bring attention to my dad, to Markus Lücke, because he physically raised his hand, but not digitally. So I think he had a question,
Okay.
you know, and I'm playing the good daughter, bringing attention to him.
Excellent. Well done, Alice. Markus.
Yeah, hello, everybody. Thanks, Alice, for helping me. Actually, I haven't yet found out how to raise my hand digitally. Okay. One thing, it did not only hit the German government on the forehead, what happened in Ukraine, but it hit also the German public on the forehead. At least it hit me on the forehead. At everybody, how do you judge the role? Do you have the idea that the German government thought it would be supported by the German public, as they probably found that there is a great outrage, has been a great outrage, which still is in the German public? How do you judge on that? That they felt supported by the swift change, with the idea that the German public would certainly support it?
I think that one is for me.
Maybe for Thomas, yes.
I think they do believe that they find support, and the polling bears that out. I would go a little further even. The idea that Germany is as defenseless as it is now is going to be an anathema to the German voting public, as very different from years past. I think every German citizen has noticed nuclear threats and what nuclear threats are and what they mean. So I do think that the debate as to whether one should end the nuclear sharing arrangement with the United States within NATO is a matter of history. I think the reason why people sleep calmly, somewhat at least, is because of the nuclear umbrella. I think that point has been made loud and clear in the last 4 or 5 weeks. I think the attitudes of the public have changed with the invasion and with the drastic nature of the announcements and the threats by Vladimir Putin. This, I would suspect, is going to have a long-term impact on the defense debate in this country.
Yeah, I would quickly interject, though, that I might be a bit more skeptical and would maybe say that once the immediate crisis that we're facing right now in Ukraine is over, that the attitudes of the German public towards the use or more military force might also go back to where they used to be. But I might be wrong there. Gerald Newsom was next.
The claim was made of the 3 legs supporting Germany, the security leg of the United States had been cut off. In what respect had it been cut off?
Yeah, that's a good question.
What I meant to say, it's not being cut off, not by the United States, but the fact that you could that you could rely to the degree that there is an armed forces that is unable to defend its own country and rely largely on a NATO, and that means an American guarantee, is undercut by the reality of this environment. So that you have to have a more robust posture yourself. Now, again, this is not, and it was said by Peter Mansour before, that this was 500,000 of a German West German armed forces. We're now talking about a 200,000 strong military that, even if equipped properly, is not going to be a large force. It's still a moderate force. This is going to be the third or fourth largest military defense budget globally, but equipping a moderately sized force with a lot of makeup investment.
Okay, Faris Al-Hassan from Berlin.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for the panel. It's very interesting. I have a quick thought about for our German contributors. I have a personal feeling that the German public is more than willing to pay a price for higher energy costs. And I have a feeling that, as usual in Germany, everyone is backing down from the power of like the tabloid media like Bild Zeitung, and also our finance minister already put up this strange plan to support people who, you know, use their car and support people who tank gas. So, what is your impression of the German general standing of the public being to cut down on energy, or like being willing to pay higher costs for energy? Yeah, that would be my question to the German speakers.
I mean, if you go to the gas station these days, it's shocking. And it's going to be more shocking. So I think the last 5 weeks, this is not now coming from nowhere. I think everybody understands where this is coming from, and it is part is paying for the mistakes of a one-sided energy policy of the past. And so I think there is a certain realization. I wouldn't go as far as to say willingness, but realization that is going to be one price to be paid. And I think the current economics minister is doing a pretty darn good job in preparing the public in doing so. He's on TV every other night explaining the situation and taking and announcing further steps towards energy independence that come along with higher price. Therefore, I think that the nexus between where it comes from and why the gas price at the pump is pretty obvious to people. That contributes to societal conversation about what needs to be, what needs to happen. Now, I can't tell you, I can't foresee what will happen if Putin cuts off the gas from one day to the next. That will be a rather dramatic situation, which is, I think, why the decision was taken to not to force it ourselves, as some of our allies would like us to. And I myself have signed a petition demanding of the government to pay the price for an embargo, because the price of Putin winning this would be much higher. But I think that's not the majority opinion in this country so far. But there is a communication effort going on to prepare the country for the possibility of this outcome.
Thank you.
Daniel Busenius. Hi.
Hello, thank you from Berlin too. Thank you very much for the panel. I have 2 points or questions. One is, I've heard from a person who works on the staff of a German member of parliament that inside the German government coalition, there is an argument going on right now whether the 100 billion, which are supposed to go to the German military as announced by Scholz, are on top of the 2%. So whether Germany is going to spend 2% of its GDP every year on the military budget, and whether the 100 billion are on top or not. I mean, if you go by Scholz, I think the 100 billion are on top. But as Mr. Kleine-Brockhoff mentioned, he talked to very few people before he gave his speech. Maybe he said maybe half a dozen. And the question is, I mean, how much consultation was there with the Green Party before Scholz gave his speech in the parliament? So I've heard that there's this debate going on. The second point, I think what you read in the media 5 or 6 weeks into this war, it is, I think the Western estimate seems to be that the Russian military performance is quite poor. That I mean, as far as I understand, the expectation in the US intelligence community was too that Russia was going to win this war quite quickly, and this didn't happen. And I think the estimate is that the Russian military performance is poor. So maybe is this going to influence the debate? I mean, how much military buildup is the NATO and the European Union? How much do they need to deter Russia in conventional military terms if the performance is so poor? To put it in a provocative way, is the conventional military threat from Russia now lower than 6 weeks ago because they lost so many soldiers, they lost so much equipment? Do we really think that if Putin wanted to do it, would Russia be really able, let's say, to attack Poland? Thank you.
Great questions. Maybe we'll start with the second one, and maybe Pete wants to say something on that part, and then Thomas and Rick can take the first question.
Sure. So you are absolutely correct. The Russian military invasion has been a disaster. Their armed forces are nowhere near as good as analysts thought they were. They've shown significant issues with leading and designing combined arms operations, gaining and maintaining air superiority. This is kind of like the blocking and tackling of military operations. And I think that they misjudged the Ukrainian defense. They thought they were just going to road march to Kyiv and take it over, that the Ukrainians wouldn't fight in their own defense. And what has happened has surprised the Russian military. Having said that, 200,000 troops have been involved of a military that numbers over 800,000. And as we look at military history, we find that militaries often adapt to combat, to what they have experienced on the battlefield. So you cannot bet that the Russian performance will not improve, that their capabilities will not increase in the future. The only thing that you can bet on is that Putin is willing to roll the iron dice and invade his neighbors. And so I would not stake Germany's security, if I were in Germany, on a bet that the Russians will remain incompetent, because I think that's a bad bet in the long run. What I would do is want to deter Putin from using his military to invade my eastern neighbors, which would be the next step after Ukraine. And the only way to do that is, as we've seen, is with hard power.
I think I would tend to agree with that. We've seen Putin is not 10 feet tall, but we should be aware that he's also not 2 feet tall. The silver lining here is that there is deterrence is possible, and that with investment, it can be done. it also can be done to a large degree on the conventional side of things from Europeans in Europe, with a moderate but not an extensive American contribution in future. Not talking about the nuclear component, that is going to be important. So to your question about the 100 billion, I had the same question initially. Is it on top or is it not? I think that's been answered in the last couple of weeks. It is not on top. The 100 billion are there to, within this term, within this government term, allow them to get to 2 or above 2%. The question that is being raised now, if that is the case, how are you going to raise the defense budget up from year 5 onwards? Because essentially what is going to, the 100 billion is going to buy you is the gap between the current defense budget and the 2% for 4 years or 5 years if you're generous, and no more beyond that. So it's a down payment, but it's not the full story.
Now I'm doing it too. I have another question for the panel, but I want to give Faris Hassan the word first. And
thank you. In some part of the German public, there's a fear that America is not the, as we say in German, the ehrliche Makler, the honest salesman or mediator, that, or broker. Yes, thank you. That the weakening of the Russian forces is welcome, and the sale of high-tech technology, like now the new bombers for Germany, that this war is actually maybe in favor for American interests too. So how would you perceive this, this difference between we're like supporting a good cause, in opposition to, okay, it's maybe a good business opportunity, or as a strategic thing that also strengthens the American position, even though at the cost of Ukrainian lives?
thank you for the question. I'm gonna give it to Rick first.
It's a tough question. I think it's true that the Ukrainians are the ones who have the real skin in the game here, and all of the allies benefit the longer they fight and the harder they resist. And that we sometimes see in other war contexts, external allies can stake out positions that are tougher than what the actual participants in it want to stick with. I don't think we're anywhere close to that right now. I don't think the United States are forcing the Ukrainians to take harder line positions. I haven't heard official American criticism of President Zelensky's overtures to perhaps seek neutrality or some other kind of accommodation, as long as there were security guarantees. I don't see the American administration just yet holding out extreme positions. Now, as we've already seen with President Biden's comment at the end of his speech in Warsaw, it's possible that the United States will not accept an outcome unless Russia is punished for this aggression, and unless it is compelled to withdraw from every inch of Ukrainian territory, and maybe even every inch of Crimea. And if the United States sticks to those positions, of course, it's going to be very difficult to get Russia to agree to all of that. It'll require a much bigger defeat than they've suffered so far, that's for sure. And as I think both Thomas and Pete have mentioned, Russia's capable of doubling down, particularly with the bombardment of civilian populations, and holding these civilian populations hostage and trying to blackmail the Ukrainian regime into more concessions, a threat of just continued punishment. And so I agree that Russia's done not well, but Russia has a way in previous wars of adjusting in often very brutal ways to just grind it out. And that will be terrible for the Ukrainians. So I guess I don't see the United States exploiting this right now. It's obviously allowed, and I think wisely, the European leaders. In some ways, we have successfully led from behind on this one. We allowed European leaders to be the voice of much of the toughest positions that NATO has.
Oh. Sorry. Rick, you accidentally muted. Sorry.
Okay. I would say one other thing. You know, before this war began, and over the last several years, there's been a clear, obvious distinction in public opinion and elsewhere between people living closer to the Soviet Union or Russia and people who'd been in the former Soviet Union and Europeans who lived further away. And the priority granted to containing Russia or dealing with Vladimir Putin differed, obviously. The Germans were clear in this. They weren't the only ones. The Italians also had different views of how to deal with the Russians and so on. Whether any of that reemerges as this war grinds on, we'll just have to wait and see. I mean, I can imagine finger pointing in both directions. People who said the expansion of NATO and not dealing with Russia in a different way would surely lead to Russian aggression and it would wreck Ukraine. And that's, of course, what's happened. That was George Kennan's view, for example. And those who saw this as inevitable Russian aggression, that there was an empire being recreated, and we told you so, will come from the Baltics and the Poles, and they will point their fingers. And it just depends on how long this goes and what the terms of agreement will be. I think that's where, coming back to Hassan's question, we'll have to watch carefully. If the external allies want more than what the Ukrainians are willing to settle for in terms of the punishment of Russia, then we could get to that point where they're pursuing this proxy context. But I don't think that's where we are now. And we'll just have to wait and see. But that's why I think this is likely to be a long war or a long conflict. I think the war will be brought to some kind of ceasefire at some point, because the willingness to take the punishment will have its limits, just humanitarian issues alone. But if the Russians then hunker down in the eastern side of the Donbass and Crimea, and they reposition force there and say, we're not leaving, and we'll accept some kind of neutralized Ukraine, and we will accept their willingness to let us annex Crimea and legitimate that, and even annex Donbass and legitimate that, then we'll have peace. And if the Ukrainians say, okay, I don't think that will be okay for the United States. I agree with Thomas, I think he said earlier, if the Russians win this at the political level, that'll be very bad for the international system. And that would be a Russian win, I think, in the Russian mind and in the minds of most people around the world, that they would have dismembered an independent country and compelled it to capitulate on the key terms that were there before the war, which were, of course, the control in the Russian territories of Russia and neutrality.
All right, thank you.
Elaborate.
Before I take Marcus again, I want to pose another question, because you brought up the issue already very nicely. And it relates to also the recent changes in German security policy. So if Russia, the question is, what actually was the cause of this war, right? There will be no clear answer at this point, and probably it's questionable whether there will ever be a clear answer. But on the one hand, as you just described, are people who believe that Putin was bent on reestablishing some greater Russian empire. The question for me then is, if the Russian military is doing so badly, I mean, Putin is maybe aggressive, but he's also clearly not stupid, right? So what was the plan there? Other people like John Mershon and Kennan maybe argued that the increasing expansion of NATO towards the east just created a threat perception in Russia, and that they continuously, and I mean, there are a lot of cases of this instances, continuously actually asked or warned the West that that increasing expansion towards the east would be taken as a threat. If the empire sort of, probably both things factor into the actual outbreak of the war, right? And they can both reinforce each other, right? So intentions might have changed over time. Rick, in the beginning, you described how Putin has changed in the last 15 years and become more aggressive, but that might have been a factor out of the unwillingness of NATO members to stop expansion towards the east as well, and vice versa, right? But the answer to the question is obviously of crucial importance, because if we have if the Russian Empire idea is what caused sort of this war, then German increases in military spending are a very good idea, right? However, if this was also primarily a sort of threat perception on Putin's part, then we might increase that threat perception, and then it might actually create more conflict, right? So in that sense, what is your, I mean, I already took it that most on the panel agree are more on the side of the Russian Empire answer, but I still don't really, let me put it this way. Let me ask you a simple question. Why did Ukraine actually have to be offered the option to become a member of NATO? And why couldn't we take it off the table? That's my question. Maybe Rick first and Pete.
Two things. We'll be debating, and historians will be debating for many, many years, why this war, and finger pointing at who caused it. And I'm not one who thinks President Putin was bent on reestablishing empire over all of the former countries of the Warsaw Pact. But in some ways, I feel that the argument over how we got here becomes less central than you're making it, because we are now here. And why it is that Vladimir Putin got to the point where he feels the West needs to be taught a lesson, so to speak, and that they have to treat Russia differently, and that he is going to use force to impose that, and so on, I think is less essential than here we are. He's done it. He's come across the line, he's attacked, and now he showed an aggressive intent that needs to be defended against, not just deterred. We failed. Deterrence failed. Now it has to be denial and defense. So I don't agree with Pete that I would bet on Russia invading NATO states as the kind of scenario I was laying out. They hunkered down and doubled down on Ukraine, and maybe Moldova, certainly Georgia, the places that Putin pointed out in the foreign ministry of Russia pointed out last December in their draft so-called peace treaty of what their objections were. They may return to some kind of arms control negotiations over the deployment of force in the Baltic and Poland, but I don't think the United States will be, or NATO will be much interested in that, because they'll be focused on deterrence in the future. I think in the immediate term, the idea that we should be concerned about Putin's threat, I mean, the threat Putin's going to face now is that he's going to lose power and be overthrown. And I also think that it's going to be difficult. We're in a commitment problem. Wars are fought because both sides think they can win. And Putin thought he could win. And I don't think he's convinced he's not going to, as I already laid out one scenario where he gets to some sense of that. I think on the other side, and I just infer this from President Biden's final comment in Warsaw again, that he cannot remain in power. I think, and maybe the rally will ease, but I think Vladimir Putin may be headed to the same kind of pariah status of Kim Jong-un. And he won't be rehabilitated, not in the United States, not in most of Western Europe, And until he's out of power, which could be for a very long time in Russia, we won't return to a normal relationship. We won't release the sanctions. And I don't know what, maybe the Europeans will start to split on that sanction regime, but I understand your worry about an escalating cycle of escalation. And it's possible there are doctrines within the Russian military to escalate, to de-escalate. But if they were to escalate to de-escalate, I'm not sure it would be a strike on Poland or a strike in the Baltic, as much it would be the use of more force in Ukraine, at least in the short run. And then in the hopes of shocking them into a bigger surrender. And the reason I think that now is that the military has done so poorly. Of course, you've dug a deep hole, and to dig it even deeper by taking on a NATO state directly and inviting NATO force directly to come in against you in the hopes that your nuclear force will deter their nuclear force, I think is extremely risky. And just as we've been cautious in terms of how to respond to this, I think at that level, President Putin will be somewhat cautious also.
Thanks. Pete, do you want to chip in on this? And then
yeah, I'll be really quick, as I realize we're at the end of our allotted time. But a couple things. I would say that there's a difference between how Putin views the former states of the Soviet Union and the states of the Warsaw Pact. And in his view, the dissolution of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century, which is saying a lot given the impact of two world wars. But it's his mindset. And so I do think that he covets the return of the Baltic states to Russian domination. He's already got Belarus, and now we see what's happening in Ukraine. So there is a potential flashpoint. I agree with Rick. I don't think an invasion of NATO is likely, but it is possible, especially given the sort of gray zone capabilities that Russia has developed. The other thing is, why did Putin do this? He's not stupid. Well, he's not stupid, but he may be misinformed. The ancient Chinese military philosopher Sun Tzu said, know yourself, know your enemy, and you can never be defeated. I don't think Putin knew either his own capabilities or the enemy's capabilities, because his advisors are not telling him what he needs to know in order to make informed decisions. In his mind, they are rational decisions, but I don't think they're informed decisions. And that has led Russia into this disastrous invasion that we see today. The final thing I will end on is we cannot be too complacent that this war will not turn nuclear. And I don't mean nuclear in the sense of a nuclear strike on the West, but imagine a cornered Putin who wants to escalate to de-escalate and lays a nuclear weapon or launches a nuclear weapon at Lviv, for instance, and says, okay, surrender now or Kyiv is next. And NATO had best be thinking about what its response will be to this sort of escalation now, because it is more rather than less likely, if Putin feels himself backed into a corner.
Thank you, Pete. We actually do have, we're being very generous today. We actually do have 2 hours, but if you need to go anywhere, then obviously you're.
Our things are normally 90 minutes. I was just assuming.
Yes, I know. I have high expectations for our audience. Thomas, I would love to hear your thoughts on this before we go to the next 2 questions.
Marta Dassou, former Deputy Foreign Minister of Italy, is with a co-author a couple of years ago written a book about Anglo nostalgia and the power of nostalgia in foreign policy. And of course, the topic here is Brexit, but she doesn't stop at Brexit, but she makes clear the mechanisms of the power of nostalgia in driving people's decision. And clearly we see a case of post-imperial phantom pain here with Putin. that his desire to rebuild empire is visible. One of those moments where he gave away a little element of that was in an interview that he gave maybe 2 weeks or 3 prior to the invasion, when he described how he, when coming back in 1990 from Dresden, East Germany, where he was a KGB officer, for a short period of time in St. Petersburg, his hometown, was a taxi cab driver. And this sort of is and we hadn't heard this story before, and it's also not relevant whether it's true or he made this up. What is relevant is that he's telling us the story, because this story connects the geopolitical with the personal. The immense sense of defeat that the end of the Soviet Union created in this man, that brought the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century, that turned him into a taxi driver. I think we can't underestimate this line of thought in his mind, his desire to recreate empire. And that also means that a lot of the reasons that he's giving us for his behavior are instrumental to that cause rather than the cause itself. Which is why I put little salience into the NATO argument, because I agree with Rick. We now need to look at where we are, and we are where we are. I would also urge us to look at the text of the December 17 draft proposals to NATO and to the US. Because when you look at them, you will find that these are onion rings of his goals. The first goal is about Ukraine. The second goal is about rolling back NATO expansion to the pre-1997 level. And the third onion ring is about America's role in Europe. And if I want to frame this from a German perspective, what he really wants is to replace the American nuclear umbrella with a Russian nuclear umbrella. And from a German perspective, whatever you think about everything East, troubling as that may be, you're taking issue with that one. So I wouldn't be so optimistic to say, well, he's not about NATO territory. Well, he is about America's role in Europe, and he's about nuclear deterrence here. And the proposition here is that both countries remove their nuclear missile capability to their own countries, which means American missiles in Virginia, Russian missiles in Kaliningrad 4 flight minutes from Berlin. That's the deal he's proposing. We need to take that seriously.
All right, thank you. So I still don't know why NATO had to join, Ukraine had to join NATO, but we'll leave that for another day. We have 2 more questions, and then I think we're going to wrap it up too, because you still have a long day ahead of you in the US, and we had a long day behind us. So Markus Lücke, why don't you start, and then Daniel.
Yes, following what Thomas Kleine-Brockhoff just said, and the others also, could you imagine that Putin would try to accomplish the world reign as such?
Can you say that again? He would try to accomplish?
Yeah, that he would try to accomplish the aim of being the emperor of the world, so to say, like Napoleon tried, like Adolf Hitler, I think, tried, and maybe others like Alexander the Great.
Well, I'll take that one. I don't think he's that ambitious. I do believe that he would like Russia to be the dominant power in Europe and it be respected as a great world power. But unlike Hitler or Napoleon, I don't think he sees Russian troops occupying Western Europe. You know, the great line from Stalin when he was asked if he was satisfied with Russian troops getting to Berlin, he said, "Well, Alexander got to Paris." I don't think Putin wants to get to Paris, but I think he'd like to dominate Paris diplomatically, and to do so, he needs to reconstruct the power that Russia once enjoyed when it was the Soviet Union.
Thomas, want to add something or? All right, then we'll move on. Danya.
That was beautiful, the Alexander piece.
Thank you for being allowed to speak for a second time. This is not normal, I know that. I want to come back to the point that the Russian military performance is rather poor. I think Rick Herman answered that Putin might still have the possibility to escalate, or his response might be to escalate. I want to make one point. If you look at the earlier wars Putin conducted, his first war in Chechnya, and the support for the Assad regime in Syria, I think there is a difference. I mean, no major power supplied weapons to the rebels in Chechnya to fight the Russians. I've just read that the Russian military performance against Chechnya, I think in 1999 or 2000, was not so good initially too, but no one supplied the rebels with anti-tank weapons and with anti-aircraft missiles, what we are doing now for Ukraine. And I think there was some limited weapon supply from the US to the rebels in Syria under the Obama administration, but I think it was quite limited because there was a fear that the weapons might end up in the hands of some Islamic terrorist group. So I think, so what would you think, what difference is this going to make?
You're right. There's not a symmetry between these previous wars because they did not have the kind of capable ally, well, not quite allies, but friends that were willing to provide weaponry. I make 2 points. It took the United States 5 weeks, roughly, to take Baghdad, a country that had virtually no friends and an army that didn't fight well. So 5 weeks in now, or a little more if we're getting there, it may have been that the Russians had unrealistically quick expectations and the American intelligence community had highly unrealistic expectations about how long this was going to take or what kind of fight it was going to be. But as Pete Mansour said, information has been revealed, as the bargaining theorists would tell us, over time, and they're learning and they're going to adjust. It could be that you're right that they will lose because the weapons coming from the West will be too much and they'll defeat the Russians and they'll retreat. I would like that, I guess. I just don't think it's very likely. I think rather they'll retreat if they're forced to retreat. If you're right, they can't sustain combat against these the weapons that are coming from the West. They'll take up more defensive positions where they can, and I worry that as they do that, certainly in the East, they'll reposition what they can in the East to hold those territories. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the escalation would come in the form of attack on civilian populations in a hostage situation, right? They'll hold the civilian populations hostage to bombardment, and there's no defense against the raining down of bombs and missiles. We're seeing in Mariupol today, and we could see it in Kyiv and Lviv in the future. And that's where I think he would escalate. And I don't know how long that would go on. I really just don't know if he would be willing to leave. I did want to say one other thing. It's true that there's a lot of Putin's background that we can point to and his nostalgia for the former Soviet Union and its power. It's very clear in the last 20 years, most everything Putin says is about respect, and the lack of it showed to Russia in the last 15 years. And so there's also not only his background when he was a young man, but his background when he's been president this last 20 years. And I don't know that I would say that his complaints about the Western world, let's say, are just instrumental, the way Thomas suggested. I think he was frustrated with the US behavior in Iraq and the US behavior in Libya and the US ignoring the Russian interest in the expansion of NATO. And he made it very clear. He said so over and over and over all the time about these things. And we weren't impressed. I think the attitude in Washington, people I know in the diplomatic corps, where the view is, why should we give anything to Russia? It's a weak, relatively moderate, capable state, economy the size of Italy. We don't have to take seriously their demands. This is silly. And we should go ahead and stick to the principle. You ask, why did Ukraine need to join NATO? And Ukraine didn't need to join NATO, but sovereignty needed to be protected. And the idea was that its right to do what it wishes to do would be protected in a liberal international order of rules and a multilateral system. That's important to defend. And there wasn't a willingness to compromise on it prior to this war. I think part of the Russian motivation here, and they misjudged terribly, was as a rising power, or a resurgent power in their case. China's the rising power. They thought now was the moment to challenge the American global order and its leadership. That's why I say, in his declarations of war, his explanations for them in February, were largely focused on the United States and the global world order it leads. And that those days were going to end. And now there was going to be a new kind of multipolar global order, maybe with he and Xi Jinping on one axis and the Western world on a different axis. And this was the moment of reckoning where he was, and I think that's part of the motivation for this too. And he's judged very poorly, right? It's a classic case of a rising power striking when it feels it's capable, but it's not. And they're now in a difficult situation because they've overreached, overextended, and they're at risk of losing much more. Maybe his rule in Russia.
All right. Well, I think we're gonna close it up here. Thank you all for attending this event today. Thank you especially to the panelists, Rick Herman, Thomas Kleine-Borkhoff, Pete Mansour. I personally have changed a lot of my ideas about this topic. Some ideas I haven't changed, and I have a lot of more questions, but I think this was shows that this was a very productive meeting. To the audience, if you're interested in future events, you should stay tuned and sign up for the Mershon newsletter. Visit their site. The same goes to German Marshall Fund. Does some excellent events. And we at Transatlantika, if you go to transatlantika.com, we actually share sort of a curated list of best of from the German Marshall Fund and the Mershon, and you can sign up for the newsletter, and then you will stay up to date with what's going on in transatlantic affairs. Thank you all again for being here today, and hope to see you again soon.